Welcome to the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater and Simon Family JCC's Lee and Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival. Today's discussion is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Family Service of Tidewater and Hampton Roads Pride. This event is held in coordination with the Jewish Book Council, the only organization in the organized American Jewish community whose sole purpose is the promotion of Jewish books. We would like to give a special thank you to our partners for help making today's event so special for our community. In today's program, we will meet Mimi Lemay, an author and advocate who will share her story and tell us about her memoir, What We Become, a Mother, a Son, a Journey of Transformation. My name is Erin Portnoy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Child Advocacy Center at Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. My program works with children and families after something tragic has happened, and we help support and empower them to give them hope and resilience. When I learned about Mimi Lemay's story, I saw what I tell my families and what I want them to know. We all have struggles and uncertainties in our lives, and having a supportive caregiver, a champion in a child's life can change their trajectory. And I can't wait for you to hear more about this one amazing woman who made a difference. So let me introduce you to our speaker today. Mimi Lemay is an international advocate for transgender youth and the author of the viral essay, A Letter to My Son Jacob, on his 5th birthday. Mimi and her family meet regularly with legislators, business leaders, educators, and clergy to share their vision of a more equitable world. She is a member of the Parents for Transgender Equality National Council at the Human Rights Campaign. Mimi holds a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. She was recently named one of the Commonwealth Heroines of 2020 by the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women. Please welcome Mimi Lemay. So for those of us who haven't read your book yet, can you tell us what you experienced with your son and why this journey was so meaningful?
Absolutely, Erin, and thank you so much. I want to take an opportunity first to thank you and to thank the sponsors, the UJF of Tidewater and the Simons JCC, as well as our partners. The work that you're doing with children who have come from trauma is essential for many different kinds of communities and has a lot of intersectional power, particularly for LGBTQ youth, some of whom are not supported in their communities and in their homes. So I'm so grateful personally for the work you're doing. I wanted to take time to say that before I answer your question. So a little bit about my background. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish community. I was born in Jerusalem, moved to Boston, then to Muncie, New York at a young age. And I lived there until I was 17 years old, then went to seminary for several years, a very ultra-Orthodox Jewish seminary in the north of England, coming back to the US and shedding a lot of the more conservative aspects of my Judaism when I came here. I ended up going to college, grad school, meeting a young man, and starting my life over, a new chapter as a Jewish person who values my Jewish roots, but not as a particularly religious person. And we bought a little home in a suburb just north of Boston, and we called it our castle on the hill. It was our first home together, and started to have our kids because having children is something I always wanted. And one after another, within fairly quick succession, maybe 5 years, I had what the doctor told me was 3 baby girls, healthy, beautiful, absolutely anatomically female in what we understood at the time, and raised them the same, to be who they wanted to be. But I saw them for at least a while as girls, and I enjoyed the feminine aspects of raising what I thought were girls. In fact, I used to dress them all the same as much as I could. But while understanding they each had unique personalities and interests. even at a young age. But when my middle child reached the age of about 2.5, that's when I started to see a big change for him. And I say him because I feel it would be disrespectful at this point. Everyone knows that this talk is about a transgender child. To use a pronoun that isn't appropriate for who he really is genuinely. Very different than my writing the book, where I was slowly trying to bring out the story as I experienced it. So at the age of 2.5, my son started to tell us that he was a boy. And at first, it really didn't register, Erin, because I didn't know a lot about transgender people at all. What I did know was a little smattering of news in the press, mostly negative stuff. We hadn't had a lot of big celebrities coming out yet at 2012. I think Chaz Bono had come out, but we weren't. It wasn't a topic of discussion widely in the news. And the depictions of transgender people in the media, in TV, and in movies were at best confused, but at worst sinister. So I didn't have much of a concept of it all. And I certainly didn't think that it could apply to a young person, a really young person like my 2.5-year-old. But as time went on, this claim of his, I am a boy, I'm not a girl, continued persistently. And along with that, increasing anger and what I would call a withdrawal. He was such a happy toddler, early toddler, such a happy baby, such kind of a middle child, a typical middle child who kind of is in the rough and tumble of things and doesn't take things too seriously, like my older child would have been more of your type A. And then my younger child, kind of the baby, but he just grew up being who he was, and who he was consistently, he was telling us, was not a girl. But he became much more angry and didn't stopped liking hugs and cuddles, would go into rages over the clothes that I'd asked him to wear, or over the fact that I said to him at the age of about 3, after some of these discussions, I said, "Look, honey, just when you take a bath, you notice that your body looks like your sister's. That means you are a girl." So what I didn't understand at the time, Erin, and I feel a lot of regret that I wasn't able to communicate this to him at the time, was that gender identity, the gender you know yourself to be, is different than your sex assigned at birth, than some of those reproductive organs and secondary sex organs that medically seem to determine whether a doctor says you are a boy or a girl. But your identity, the way you know yourself to be in terms of masculinity, femininity, who you are, that is gender identity. And that is formed between the age of 2 and 4. Typically, it begins to be formed. The discovery process can continue throughout your whole life. And that is something that you do not choose. It is something that you are. It may evolve, but at every stage of your life, it is only you that know deeply, truly inside, if you are a man, a woman, or something in between, something either non-binary, right?
Right. So how did you know that Jacob was transgender and that it wasn't a stage?
So that's a great question, because the answer is, in the beginning, I didn't know. And so, like a typical parent who didn't understand this topic, and there wasn't a ton out there for very young kids, I flailed for a very long time. I'll be perfectly honest. I grasped at straws. I thought, oh, middle child syndrome. This kid does not want to be like his sisters. He's acting out, or he's just a tomboy. Or maybe, I was talking to one of the educators at his preschool, and she said, you know what? Sometimes some kids feel more comfortable playing with boys because the boys aren't getting into the drama and the house play as much. And maybe that's something that your child doesn't feel comfortable with. So she thinks she's, a boy. And so I grasped at all kinds of straws. We hired a therapist to try to figure out what all these anxieties were about. Because, Erin, it was terrible to see a very young kid who'd been so happy fall into this kind of this hooded look on his face where he didn't want to relate to us anymore. And I even entertained that, maybe our child was neurodiverse in some way. Maybe he was on the autism spectrum, but none of the things that were happening really matched. Um, something like that. It felt like everything was coalescing around this topic of gender and him saying, I really am a boy. I'm not pretending. He would say, I'm not pretending, with so much anger.
Mm-hmm.
And his clothes, he became completely obsessed with wearing this blue sweater, which actually I bought it at Gymboree and it was in the girls section, but it was a cornflower blue sweater with a turtleneck and a picture of a like embroidered dog on the front. And that was his doggy sweater, and he wore it for about 4 months. And that was a battle that I quickly gave up, realizing that there were more important things. But as we got towards summer of his, 2.5, 3 years, 3.5 years old, he's getting toward the summer, and I'm thinking, oh my God, he won't even take this off for ballet class. How are we going to get him into the pool with a cornflower blue turtleneck sweater? So we had these moments, but thankfully there was enough out there when you Googled to kind of realize that gender, in some ways, I understood that this was serious. Even though there wasn't a lot about very young kids, books would start talking about kids who were like in early elementary school, but my kid was already like just in 3-4 years old, just preschooler, right? I decided that we needed to do something. We needed to take this seriously. And there were several indicators that our child really knew who they were, or at least believed who they were, that they were a boy. And one of those indicators, this moment where the penny dropped, was I was standing in one of the school kind of auditorium, talking to the teacher in a parent-teacher conference. We'd just gone through all the adorable little papers that showed that my child was learning their ABCs and their alphabet and drawing beautiful pictures and doing poems. And she hesitated at the end of the pile of papers, the teacher, and she said, I got one more thing to show you. And she showed me a drawing that he had done, all in black, angry scribbles of people with frowns on their faces, dark storm clouds ahead, and he had labeled it with his born name, right? And he had, because he'd been asked to do that, but then afterwards she said, he immediately crossed it out, and he's been doing that. And that moment of realizing that this name did not only not represent him, but it brought him pain. That moment really shifted my thinking, instead of how do we fix this and get rid of this problem, to, oh geez, we need to understand that this, at least for my child, this is real, and I need to go about and figure out what's going on. And so from there on, we started to I made contact with a therapist who understood LGBTQ kids, had worked with them. We went to the Gender Education Management Clinic in Boston Children's. I think there's a different name for that now, but I keep remembering the old name, the GEMS Clinic in Boston Children's. And from there found a therapist who was able to explain to me that what my child was going through was natural for a person who might be transgender, that his consistence and persistence and insistence that he was something other than his sex assigned at birth was an indication that we as parents needed to support, possibly at one point a transition, which at his age would just mean allowing him to live authentically who he wanted to be. And the real proof came in the transition, in allowing him to be, saying, who do you want to be? Who do you want to live as? And him answering, I want to be a boy named Jacob always. And the joy and the healing that followed.
It's amazing that, that's such a journey for you as a parent. And like, how was your family with this journey as well? Can you just talk a little bit about your family's reaction? And
yeah. So, I think for most of my family, the only piece that was needed was education. That mainly that their grandson, for example, my mother-in-law, who is Catholic, um, she would probably call herself more of a spiritual Catholic, but she needed to hear that her grandson would be okay being transgender, because it can be frightening for parents and grandparents. It wasn't a widely discussed topic back in 2012 in terms of little young children. There had been a few breakout stories, but it hadn't entered sort of the national conscience the way it is today. And so we needed to let her know that he would live a normal life if he were supported, and that the statistics for trans kids who aren't supported are horrific. We have, 40% attempted suicide rate for transgender youth. And those numbers are unacceptable for any parents. So our choices felt very, very narrow. It was support our son, get him the very best possible help that he can when he needs it, and to clear the way so that his school and his community would accept him, or to suffer possibly the outcomes that we knew a lot of transgender youth were experiencing, which were, like I said, unacceptable. So for her, that journey was quick. For my mother-in-law, for my mom, still living in a very ultra-Orthodox community at the time, it was a little harder. I think it was harder for her to wrap her head around the idea of gender identity not being the same as sex assigned at birth. And, the community that she lived in and that she had chosen to live in did not accept transgender people, did not even yet accept, and still does not accept gay and lesbian and bisexual American, people as well. So there's a long way to go within the ultra Orthodox community towards inclusion, and I hope that work will be done. But her journey, she took a while. I would say she had a lot of questions. She had a lot of doubts. And it wasn't until after the transition, several weeks into the transition, when she could really see that Jacob had come out of his shell, was laughing, talking, taking an interest in things, had transformed into this happy child, that I think that was that proof in the pudding for her loving her grandchild, her Jewish grandchild, and wanting him to live a whole and healthy life. She has somehow reconciled that while still remaining in the Orthodox community.
I mean, that's a testament to her also. And speaking of the ultra orthodox community and your history, like you mentioned in the book that when Jacob began to express his gender identity as male, you sensed this. You had a sense of deja vu, and with your own life path and your own journey, and you wove that into the book as well, within the chapters describing Jacob, and then going back to your own life. Can you talk a little bit about how these stories sort of wove together for you?
Thank you for asking that question. So for me, when it came time for me to talk more extensively about our journey, I had the opportunity to write a book. I had, several publishing houses and agents reach out and say, we think this story needs to be told, after I'd written my letter to Jacob. Um, the question then became how to write this story. I could extend the letter, which began at his birth and ended with his transition, and just make each piece of that an additional chapter. But I knew that wasn't telling the whole story, because the experience of the confusion and the learning that I did as a parent, those moments of letting go of preconceptions of what I thought my child would be, and the moments of redemption at the end were so integrally tied to what I had both experienced and lost growing up. Um, I don't know how many of our members and people listening have familiarity or have grown up in a very ultra Orthodox Jewish community, but mine was in some ways, very typical of the ultra Orthodox communities, that there were very segregated roles, prescribed roles for men and women in this community, and very little wiggle room for those roles, because those roles were tied into, at least this is what I was told my entire life growing up, they were tied into our tachlis, or tachlit, our purpose in life. And our purpose is divine. It is God-given. And so as a woman, I grew up believing that my modesty, both my modesty in my dress, covering everything up, and eventually when I got married, I would cover my hair. Modesty in my speech, to not be outspoken, to not have public facing roles in my community, to not look men in the eye when I spoke to them, to have a certain kind of smallness was important in my community, and that was taught to me from a very early age, and modesty in my ambitions, I would say, as well. um, they were all important to my fulfillment of my life as a Jewish woman, according to the model in which I grew up in. And this bothered me for a lot of reasons. First of all, because I had ambitions. I loved my Torah learning growing up. I went through a brief rebellious stage, which would seem laughable, because it didn't include drugs. It didn't include, dating anyone. It didn't include any of those things that parents like. It didn't include sex. Like, my rebellious stage was, I wanted to wear my skirt just 2 inches below my knee. I wanted to see PG-13 movies. I wanted to wear a little bit of makeup. I wanted to be able to read more secular books. But to the way I was raised, and to my teachers and the community I was in, those things were all, a road that down which most awfulness would happen. And so I loved my learning, and that was something that kept me in the Orthodox community for a long time, because the primacy of the study of the Torah texts, and the primacy um, of the interpretation of those texts by rabbinic literature over the ages, the Gemara and all that, was so important in this community, and it was so available, but it wasn't available to me. Because as I grew older and then ended up going to seminary, hoping to learn more Torah and hoping to have more in-depth understanding, we were kind of funneled into a different path than our male counterparts. Whereas their learning was taken as their primary directive in life, is to become one with their creator through their learning and through their intellect, I was meant to learn only in order to be able to keep a kosher Jewish home. And in order to urge my husband and to respect my husband's learning. And we were often in seminary, we were often told, you don't really need to know more than this. You just need to know what you need to know to keep the laws of Sabbath or kosher, and don't ask too much. And we were not given the actual textbooks, the Gemara and the Mishnah, and all these incredibly primary texts for Jewish learning. We were not given them, because that would have indicated to us that learning was a purpose unto itself for us as females, and that was not the case. So I went through a deep sense of disappointment, Erin, and shame over my wanting more for my life, my not being happy with the role I was assigned as a woman. Now, I never questioned my gender identity, despite the fact that being a woman was so hard for me growing up in this Orthodox community, and that so many things rankled me. So that's the great distinction between the journey that I went through and my son's. But it almost destroyed me at a point in my young life when I was about 20, 21 years old. I had just been through a failed engagement, through no fault of my own. Something had happened. This arranged engagement that I'd had on the side of the groom, and my parents, and my mom and my stepdad, had ended the engagement. And I was left in this limbo as a young Orthodox woman who was supposed to get married between the ages of 18 and 21. And here I am approaching 21, 22, and realizing that this life is just too painful for me. So I had some really dark moments before I decided to leave the community. And when I left the community, Erin, I felt like I was outcasting myself, that I had put myself in chayram, that I had excommunicated myself. And the guilt that I felt for that um, turned into anger. It turned into anger against the community, against my Judaism, and even against God, who I had persisted in believing in. But the role that he had given me felt like a cruel joke. And so I created this entirely different life with my, non-Jewish husband and my children. And sure, we went to synagogue on holidays, but I cut off any connection to my roots for a period. And when my son began to show a deep unhappiness over gender, it almost felt like I had this moment where I said, not again. Like, is God messing with me? Is this some kind of retribution? And I felt this moment of I cannot let this happen to my child. My child cannot grow up having this imposed on him, this painful imposition, the shame that I saw that he was taking it on himself. I can't allow that for my kid. And I think that propelled me to try to find a solution, to try to truly understand what Jacob needed from me. And the beauty of it is that when he transitioned, and I write about it in the book, and I have this moment that just felt miraculous to me, Erin. And I won't spoil it for the readers, but I felt like I had a message from above, that I had been on the right path all along, and that I needn't have thought of myself as an outcast, because had I not left the community I was raised in, I don't think a son like Jacob could have survived in my care. Because to this day, there is no mention of transgender children in the ultra-Orthodox community. They are either, conversion therapy is either applied to make them shy away from expressing their true identity, or who knows what. I mean, who knows how many people are suffering in communities like this, that they either have a choice of having to leave the community or not be themselves. And so, for me, that moment of realizing that my journey was necessary in order for Jacob to thrive brought me a redemption, and a feeling of great love and connection with my own Judaism and with God. And I carry that with me to this day. And my Judaism now completely informs my advocacy, my sense of responsibility for the world, and that we know that saving one life is like saving the world, the universe.
Right.
And the abjuration, like, do not stand by idly, when your brother is bleeding on the side of the road. That we have this responsibility as Jews, as humans, to create a more inclusive world, so that people do not turn to ending their own lives because they are discriminated against, because life is made untenable for them. And so that is, to me, that was one story to tell. I had to tell that story side by side. That was a really long answer. But it was
like, just to be able to hear how you made that correlation, that parallel between the difficulty and the process of your journey, and then relate it to what your son Jacob was going through. I mean, it's really inspiring and really wonderful that you were able to make that comparison. And you were saying that you in the ultra Orthodox community, you were really taught not to have that voice and not to be outspoken. And now you are this outspoken mother, and an advocate, and like that just it speaks volumes. And speaking of advocacy, which I love that word, can you talk about your journey to becoming an advocate to the transgender community? Because you could have just decided, this is just going to be what I'm doing with my family, and I have enough on my plate. But you've taken it to that next level.
Thank you. I love to talk about my advocacy, and it's really important to me and my family. So, taking it to the next level, I think we had this short honeymoon period, Erin, where we had our friends and family who supported us. We'd come out. Everyone knew that Jacob was Jacob, who was in our circle, and he was thriving, and everything was just great. And I knew that there were statistics out there. I knew that trans people were experiencing hardship at a completely unacceptable level in their schools and businesses, in society, and in legislation. But it didn't. I was living in my bubble. I live in Massachusetts, and everything was great, and my son was happy, and I had just been through a huge transformation as a family, and I did have that instinct of like, we're doing good, we're okay. And I think the moment that my bubble really shattered was shortly after the transition, maybe about 6 months later. It was just after Christmas, and the headlines hit that a young transgender girl in Ohio had taken her own life. She was 17 years old. Her name was Leila Alcorn. May she rest in power. And and she had left behind a letter explaining why she could not endure any longer. And in this letter that her friends had published on social media, she had described the pain of living in a community where people do not support you, where you can lose your job, lose your family, be out on the street just for the brave choice of living authentically. Um, and it was a plea. It was a plea for help. She said, "Fix society, please. This can't go on. People need to know what's happening." And people started to know what's happening because of this young woman who tragically lost her life. Because this piece of news hit the new hit the airwaves, hit the TV, and suddenly people were talking about transgender youth. Um, and the conversations I was seeing were, there was a bunch of buckets. I was seeing people who were saying, "Gosh, I don't know much about this topic, but this poor girl, and I wish her parents had allowed her to be who she was, and this is a tragedy." There was a very small number of people who understood um, what it means to be transgender, or who were transgender, who was starting to speak up for the first time and saying, "I'm transgender, and this should never be happening, and this is horrible, and we need to fix this." For Leela, for all the other young people, for the transgender adults who can't live their life in the open. And then there were the people who were saying, and there was a lot of voices, a young person can't be transgender. Being transgender is a choice. Her parents had every right to try to force her to not be, to be her gender assigned at birth, to live as her, gender assigned at birth. Um, and then even more disturbing, there were people who were saying, God either made you man or a woman. It's either the X or the Y chromosome, or XY or XX chromosome, and you can't change that. And it's a mental illness, and all these awful things coming out. Um, and false. I mean, even if you're just looking at biology, there's a lot more than XX and XY chromosomes. There's about 150 variations on the sex chromosomes. So even that was so ill informed. And I realized at that moment that two things. First of all, that there was a world of transgender young people out there and transgender adults who were in serious jeopardy because of the ignorance out there, and because people didn't understand or support them in living their authentic lives. And secondly, that even Jacob was not safe, because he was still very young. He was almost 5 at the time that we began our advocacy, but he wasn't going to stay 5 forever. And he was going to go out into the world, and he was going to hear what people said, and he was going to have to either hide who he was, or we're going to have to change the world for him. And there were no other choices, in as far as I could see. um, One day he would travel, one day he would go to another state, one day he would want to start a family. Where could he do that? We couldn't be in a situation where he wasn't safe across the map. And so that's when I sat down, and with Jacob's permission, I wrote this letter to him on his 5th birthday, and I talked about um, the joy of him coming out to us, and even the hardship of it in the beginning, how confused I was, and how that turned to joy and understanding. And I was hoping that people would read that and it would be a call to support transgender youth. And pretty soon afterwards, it went viral, and I knew very little, Erin, about the internet. I mean, I'd use the internet. I was your Gmail and Facebook person. I think maybe I had a Twitter account that I never used, and I still don't. But it was a really scary and a big leap of faith, I think, on our part as a family, that this advocacy would work out well. But we're very grateful that it did. And we were invited soon after doing that to join organizations in Boston and Massachusetts. Sorry, I'm gonna cough. This is always the part in the talk when my voice gives out. We were invited to join to help pass some pro-LGBTQ legislation, particularly a public accommodations law in Massachusetts that had been that there had been attempts to pass over the years, and it just hadn't made it across the finish line. And so we stood out, and spoke up, and with Jacob's permission. And it has been a really, really positive experience for us, because of course we've drawn hate and people have had negative reaction. But what I've seen over time, as my advocacy evolves and as I become involved in more national work, is that the public is becoming more educated, and people are starting to understand what transgender kids need to support them. And to live happy, healthy lives, and that they have the right to have those lives, and as well for transgender adults and non-binary adults as well. And I'm seeing people who may have no connection to the community mounting defenses online, in Facebook posts, in Twitter, saying, you're wrong about this. The American Academy of Pediatrics supports transitioning a child young. And no, it's not true that young children are having surgeries and all kinds of stuff that's being misinformation that's being thrown out there to kind of cloud the issue. So I'm seeing a lot of allies stepping up. But the truth is that we need those allies more than ever, and we need more of them. Because this year has been absolutely horrific, Erin, in terms of anti-trans legislation in the states. Right. We've had 250 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced this year alone. And, we are not even midway through May. So this is pretty scary. And some of these bills, and the worst of these bills, are aimed at transgender youth, like Jacob. And there's two categories. One of the bills, well, there's more than two types of bill, but there's two main categories. One is to prevent them accessing their life-saving healthcare that they need, and to prevent the providers from giving them healthcare, to criminalize medical care for trans youth. The medical care that the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists and American Medical Association have said is essential for these kids. And the other form of bills that we're seeing in a lot of states is sports bills to prevent trans youth in schools, all the way from kindergarten, all the way up to high school and beyond, from just playing sports with their teammates, which is a form of segregation. It's your separate, separate, not equal. You can't play with your teammates, creating these fictionalized reasons that they're going to, blow everyone off the field. They're going to be so good at what they do, trans women, trans girls in particular. And this is not supported by any evidence at all. You can't even name on the fingers of five hands. I mean, one hand, you can't name on the fingers of one hand, or even two fingers, trans girls in sports, in school, who have won championships or taken scholarships from anybody. It just does not happen. They have enough to contend with, that this kind of discrimination is just pretty horrific. So, I'm sure you have more questions, and I'll let you ask them, but this moment is so important. And that's why I'm so grateful that our sponsors and you and the partners that have partnered to bring me here are concerned with this too, and that they see this moment as really pivotal.
Sure. Well, and I'll give you a second just to take a breath, because I know you're giving us so much information and it's so helpful. I know, and I just wanted to, I know that you're aware that I work for a children's hospital, and, um, I see children in the, coming to the emergency department, really every day, who are having mental health issues and are suicidal, and they're having, they're transgender, or, they're various, you know, they're trying to figure themselves out. And so it is happening here too. And it's so critical, like you were saying, that that we have allies, um, because I mean, you have to have allies across the board. Like, even if you are not, um, a person of color, you support people of color. If you're not transgender, you support the transgender movement. So we have to have allies, in order to make these changes. So I thank you for saying that. And I hear that you have a voice, and other parents, uh, need to step up as well. How do you get families to kind of, understand what their children are going through? One of the things that we have difficulty even here is, if we have a child that wants to, that tells us their name is this, and the parent is saying, no, you have to call my child this. How do you reconcile that, and work with the family?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would take it on two levels. First, talking about what we can do more immediately with families, and then nationally, what's really important in legislation coming up. And before I talk to those 2 points, I want to also, I'm so glad you brought up, the intersectionality of this in some ways, because those in the LGBTQ community who face the most discrimination are generally Black and Brown trans women. And they have a horrific rate of violence against them, death from unnatural causes. And in fact, this year looks like it might be one of the most violent years ever, as it is shaping up for trans women of color. So it's like absolutely important for us to see this, not only as, the amazing thing about the LGBTQ community is that they come from all walks of life. They come from all racial backgrounds and in religions, and all those things that make the variety of human experience so precious. And so, realizing that we need to focus a lot of that attention on LGBTQ communities of color is also an important part of this work. But how do we support families to understand? Well, I'm grateful to say that there is a lot more out there today. We have generally in most states, I think in all states, there's a chapter for PFLAG. That's kind of an older name. It's Parents for Lesbian and Gay Families and Children, but today it includes transgender and non-binary and questioning and queer children of all stripes. So these organizations usually provide support groups. They have resources on their websites, and it's very suited to parents who are just beginning this journey, because generally speaking, people who moderate these groups and they'll get a lot of parents who are kind of in that stage of, I just don't know, is this a stage, or what if I support this, am I going to push my child in one direction? The answer is no. This is their journey. Regardless, all you can do is support. And there's also more information out there. So the American Academy of Pediatrics does have a wealth of information and is a very reputable source that most parents can say, oh, I can trust this. The largest professional organization in this country for pediatricians. And so we're seeing more information out there. We're seeing groups like the Human Rights Campaign that I work with have created all kinds of resource guides for parents who are trying to help their child navigate in-school transition. And we also have other fabulous organizations like GLSEN, the Gay Lesbian School Education Network, which just has a ton of resources. And a lot of these organizations will come in and do trainings in schools, and they'll talk to parents. So I think that's really important. I do know there's a social media, like a group join called Transforming Families, which is very helpful for parents who need more information and need more resources and are really just trying to figure this out. And it's headed by two wonderful friends of mine. And so I do very highly recommend that. But at the end of the day, as a parent, knowledge is power. Knowing that, you know, transgender and non-binary youth meet certain challenges that can make being young and trans really, really hard, and can be, in some ways, can carry some risk with it in terms of not supporting, leading to mental health issues. But also, they should know that there's a lot of hope, because those kids who are supported, those kids who know that when they come home in that door, their parents look at them and they value them for who they authentically are, and love them unconditionally, those kids have a much better chance of living an absolutely normal life. And it's us parents who are facing the world and saying, you guys have to change. We have to support these kids, because when kids are supported, they can be healthy and happy.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. And there are a couple questions that are coming in. And you touched on, you talked about the school and how the school can help. There's a question about how teachers, what they can do in an online course or in person to make it clear that they're allies. This person puts like she, her, hers on, in her label, in her name, so they know. And you mentioned a group that will speak to teachers, and can you mention that name again?
Sure. I mean, there's quite a few groups out there who do trainings. I like Welcoming Schools by the Human Rights Campaign. So if you go to hrc.org and you click through to Welcoming Schools, you can arrange for training. GLSEN is another one, GLSEN. I believe it's glistenSomethingStudents.org, but you can look it up, GLSEN, GLSEN. PFLAG generally, depending on the state, has different levels of resources for students and families. And there's also some good books out there as well for LGBTQ kids in classrooms. And I can try to send some more information. But there's a lot more out there now, and I think that even the NEA, the National Educators Association, the biggest teachers union, are getting on board and are starting to create their own resources. So this is a big movement. We're seeing a greater inclusion in the schools. Not in every school, but we are seeing, and I think even in states where some legislators are coming and saying, I want to speak to my base. I'm going to introduce this law that nobody really wants, this bill to try to prevent trans kids from, living authentically at school. It's generally the teachers and the principals and the staff who are working with these kids every day and see these kids and want these kids to be okay and healthy, that they don't like that imposition. And so I am finding that the educator community are our greatest allies. And for all you out there who are educators, thank you, because we need you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is more, just kind of going back on a more personal level, just how do you explain what's going on to Jacob, and how old is Jacob right now?
He's 11.
He's 11. Okay. So, as things come up in his life, and how are you explaining, just the world and different things to him?
So, and for me as a parent, since we advocated very early and we offered an explanation for the reason we were talking about our story, because not everybody understands what it means to be trans. And we want to tell parents that they can support their kids and their kids are going to be all right if they support them. And so that was kind of the pare down message that we spoke to Jacob about for a few years. But, when we started to join press conferences and talk to, legislators in Massachusetts about these bills, he had to hear some of what the opponents were saying. And, I'm seeing this again but in a far more harmful way for families in states like Texas, for example, where they are on the cusp of passing a law which will criminalize supporting trans kids. It'll criminalize it for the doctors and for the therapists, and it'll criminalize it for the parents. It is by far the most horrific bill that we are seeing now. And we're also seeing young kids having to stand up and actually provide testimony in the legislature to people who are closing their hearts and minds to them. And that leaves a toll. I think that for us, the fact that we are in Massachusetts and that so many of the folks who were in charge in the legislature and in our local government were supportive made a big difference for Jacob. So he knew that we had a goal to accomplish. He knew that not everybody understood. He knew that somebody would stand up and say, these are little girls pretending to be boys and things like that. And I would just look at him and say, you don't listen to that man because you know who you are. And that was, I think, enough for a while, at least. But for the kids in these other states having to hear like just the most horrific things, my heart goes out to them. And I think that that's one of the reasons I say, like, the community of allies, we need to stand with those kids because it can be really harmful. And the Trevor Project, which is a national organization to combat suicide in LGBTQ youth, the largest organization of this type, publishes a study every year that they ask questions of LGBTQ young people, and they discovered that over 85% are deeply affected by the legislation that they're hearing about, whether they're living in supportive states or not. So I continue to tell Jacob little bits and pieces about what's going on as much as he asks. If he asks me a question, I'll tell him, I'm very open with him. And he understands that this is a battle he's part of. And over the years, he has himself transitioned from being more hesitant about personally being involved and speaking to people about this to actually being incredibly proud and open about who he is and proud of his role as an advocate. And although I wish he didn't have to fight this way, I really hope that these experiences will give him an added layer of empathy for others, and a level of resilience to be able to meet whatever challenges he has in life. And I think that's what we hope for all our kids.
I agree. I think that it is going to be a challenge, and again, to have I can't stress enough to have a supportive parent, have someone on the child's side is so important. And there are people asking questions about. There's a parent of a transgender young adult who is struggling, and they're wanting directions for resources for them. And you had mentioned so many resources, and I'm wondering if you said you could get those to us, and I just want to let the audience know that we can get resources from you and then send it out to all who've registered to the event. So you're talking about the schools and parents, and there's so many different categories, or even in legislation, like how can we as allies advocate? So I know you'll get that to us, so thank you.
Absolutely. And, hrc.org is a wonderful, Human Rights Campaign is a wonderful organization that kind of has all of these topics covered. And so that's a really good starting resource. There are guides for parents, there are guides for schools, there's guides to explain transition care, should a person decide to have age appropriate transition medical care, and all that kind of stuff. So that's like a one-stop shopping for me when I'm looking something up. And it also, you'll hear about the Equality Act coming up in the Senate, hopefully really soon, and how important that is. And the reason for that is the Equality Act will add gender identity and sexual orientation to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, meaning that no discrimination across the board in housing, in public accommodations, in education, in all avenues and areas of life for gender minorities. And so that's going to be critical, because we can't have this back and forth in the states, in such a checkerboard situation where you can travel and live in one state and you can't in another, and then parents are unfortunately having to flee some of the states with the worst legislation. So
Right, and it shouldn't have to be which state is the best for my family. I'm in total agreement. I just wanted to let you know that there is a comment as a mother of a transgender young man, age 22. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and the acceptance that my son received from his teachers and friends. So, I mean, there's a lot of thank yous. There's a lot of questions, like I said, about getting resources. So, oh, and I just saw another note that says both our senators are signed on, Senator Kane and Senator Warren. So that's all great stuff. Um, I know that we're coming to the end of our talk today. I didn't know if you wanted to have like a final words for wrapping up. I'll let you have some final words.
yeah, thank you. The feeling that rises in me is a sense of gratitude that the people who came here today came to listen, how they can understand and support trans and non-binary youth, at their hour of need. And I really appreciate the attention being given to this, and the spirit of wanting to help. And I hope that everyone here will take that into action and will either sign up with one of these organizations. And Keshet is a Jewish organization that works on LGBTQ equality, and I can't speak enough of them. If you want to turn, your faith community into a supportive and activist faith community, they're a wonderful organization to keep in touch with. Turn those sentiments of wanting to help into action. Be sure to keep updated on legislation and to support pro-equality legislation, and to speak up when the alternative comes about. I do feel we're moving in the right direction. There's a saying that was really important when I was growing up. And I think it's in Aramaic, and the word is ikvisa de Mashiach. And it literally translates to the birth pangs of the labor pains of the Messiah. And to me, in my own modern understanding of the world, um, I'm not looking for anyone to come save us. As I think Barack Obama said, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. Um, I'm not looking for a savior, but what I am looking for is a better world for our kids. And these are the birth pains. These are the labor pains, which means there will be forces that try to push back, and there will be people that see the writing on the wall that we are becoming a more inclusive society in every way. Um, and this is the moment where we have to push the hardest to bend that arc towards justice. And I hope that I have all of you with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you for your time today and all of your words of wisdom. Your story is so moving. And I hope the community will read and purchase your book. If you would like to join Mimi in her work, including supporting the passage of the Equity Act, visit adl.org for more information. Thank you again to our partners, Jewish Family Services of Tidewater and Hampton Roads Pride, for making this event possible. And to our audience, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed the program. Be sure to visit jewish-v-a.org/bookfest for all of our upcoming events. Tomorrow, we will welcome another author, Hallie Efron, virtually to Tidewater at 7:30 p.m. And next week, the Blue Dove Foundation will join us Thursday, May 20th, to discuss the book Quieting the Silence. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Bye bye.